noblewoman who donated a large sum of money to the church in her hometown. She donated this money so that they could build a bell tower. They had a fairly large complex, and the complex did not have a bell tower, and so they used this money to begin construction, and they had plans to build an 8-story white marble bell tower. For the first 5 years, things went well. They got the first 3 floors done. Then they discovered a fatal flaw. And they have spent the last 850 years trying to fix that flaw. The amazing thing about this bell tower, this white, majestic marble bell tower, is that even though they found this fatal flaw, after 3 stories, they went ahead and put another 4 stories on top. It ended up being 7 stories high. And about 100 years later, they finally dedicated their bell tower. The bells finally were able to ring for the church complex, letting people know that a service was about to begin. It's one of the most famous buildings in all of Western civilization now. We know it as the Leaning Tower of Pisa. That tower leans because the fatal flaw was not fully understanding that the soil that they were building this heavy, heavy marble tower was mostly shell, sand, and water, with a little bit of clay for good measure. They didn't do their homework. Building buildings and houses on sand is always a dubious thing. Ask Elon Musk, right? He's a few years late, and it's a few $1 million more expensive now, because the original designs for what's going on at Boca Chica Beach weren't accurate. They messed up. They had to truck in more sand. Look at talk about the way it is here in Los Fresnos here. You could go to my house, right, sweetie? Our soil is sand. So over 7 years that we've lived there, our house has shifted a bit. And you can see places where it has shifted because it's the soil here tends to be a little more sandy. So it's when Jesus tells this story about building on rock and sand, it is something that it immediately connects with us because we know what happens. So today we're going to begin our being challenged. Actually, we begin today. Next week is what we're really going to be in. Today's a prequel. We're going to talk about what it means to be like Jesus. We're going to start with this story. Now, this story is told by one of Jesus' best friends. Matthew spent 3 years of his life with Jesus. And he writes a letter to a gathering that is much like this one this morning. And along the way, he is encouraging his gathering, people who have questions. Is Jesus really the one who came, and was he really the promised Messiah of the Old Testament? Is he really the guy that we were supposed to be looking for? And then this guy, again, we have put our faith in him, but as things get a little more dicey with the Roman government, and life gets a little more difficult, are we really sure that's the guy? That person that we put our faith in? After all, we expected our Messiah to ride in on a white horse, not get himself killed. We were expecting our Messiah to overthrow the Roman authorities, not be killed by the Roman authorities. And so Matthew writes his letter. And along the way, at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, he provides an account of one of the most famous sermons ever preached. It was preached by Jesus. And Jesus preaches a sermon on a hillside to a crowd. He's talking about what the kingdom of heaven looks like. At At the very end of his sermon, Jesus impresses on the crowd and those that have been listening that they just can't leave the mountainside and just like, it is what it is, life goes on. What they've heard, they have to do something with what they've heard. They have to do something with the person who has been talking about this. This isn't something that you could just walk away from. So he ends his sermon with this story. A story about a wise man who builds his house on a rock and a foolish man who builds his house on sand. And the conflict of the story is a storm that comes along, and we heard Mike read it, and we know what happens. The storm comes, the house on the rock stands, and then at the very end, it's interesting how this whole thing ends. The one that's been built on the sand, it's not simply falls down. No, it comes down with a great crash. Now, a lot of times, we come to the story, again, some of us are very familiar with the story. We heard it when we were little kids, growing up, being taught in our Bible schools and in our Sunday schools. It's very easy to come to this story, and you hear this story at times, and it's all about good moral living versus just living on the fly. This is the encouragement that, hey, the wise man, the wise man follows Jesus' word, so he is true to his wife. He treats people with honesty and integrity. At the end of his life, he has something to show for it. Versus somebody like we have in the prodigal son, who just lives it up, right? Boozes it up, is dishonest with people, cheats on people. And at the end of his life has nothing, his kids hate him, has nothing to show for it. That kind of moral story. We tend to treat the story this way. The ironic thing is, if we come to the story and we treat the story this way, we end up missing what's actually going on here. You're going to hear me say this again later. You end up really building your house on the sand because that's not what is happening here. If we come to this, and this is just one big Aesop's fable, if this is just one big TED Talk from Jesus, then our house is going to be the one that crashes at the end. Okay, so we're to pay very close attention because it's very easy for us to just run right through this. Here's what Jesus actually says. Here's how Jesus starts his story. Everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. So, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them. So we're programmed to hear the verbs there, right? Everyone who hears, everyone who acts on. Some of your Bibles may say everyone who does. But there's something else going on here that even the crowd there, as they hear Jesus tell this story, they pick up on it because Mike did not read this verse, but at the very end, the people are amazed at his authority. There's nobody they've heard talk like this. And you want to know why? It's what he's saying. Not through the whole sermon, but also here at the end. We must begin this story by hearing what Jesus actually says. Everyone who hears these words of mine. This story starts and ends with Jesus. These words of mine. And what shocked this crowd, what is shocking to this crowd, what would have been shocking to Matthew's gathering, is that this is when Jesus says this, he has, in some of their minds, has no right to say this. Because now everyone who hears these words of mine and then puts them into practice, the only guy that has that kind of authority in their lives is Moses in the Old Testament. Only God can talk this way. Everyone who hears these words of mine. You see, this letter,
that Matthew is writing to his gathering started off, this is the promised one. You know why? Starts off with a miraculous birth. Now, an angel shows up to a guy named Joseph, says, hey, the one that is being carried by your fiance is the promised one of the Old Testament. He is coming to save his people from their sins. This is all about Jesus. This is the promised one. So the one who has been sitting on that hillside with this sermon is this promised one. And this promised one is to be heard. He's to be believed. And his words should be put into practice. Everyone who hears these words of mine. And now, because it's Jesus, that's the other thing that we need to make sure that we hear as we listen to what he says here. Everyone who hears these words of mine. So, where do we find Jesus' words? Where do we find what he has to say? Now, it's very easy for us to think, oh, he's simply talking about everything he said in that sermon, and it's true. That's the immediate context. But he's also talking about everything that follows in that letter. And he has a lot more to say in the book of Matthew, this letter that he writes to this gathering. But it's even further than that. Jesus started talking at the very beginning. In the beginning was the Word. He starts in Genesis. Goes through all the way to the end of the book. All of these words. Everyone who hears this word of mine and puts it into practice. So again, this isn't simply about hearing and doing. This is about the one who is actually making these claims. The one who is delivering this sermon. You see, for the people on that hillside that day, what Jesus is saying is, you need to believe me. You need to put your faith in me. Listen to my words. My words are life-changing. Listen to me. And that brings us then to the point of the story, the hearing or acting and doing, right? Everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And then there's the contrast, right? The one who doesn't. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them, which, oh, by the way, you can hear the word, but if there is no faith present and there's no doing, then it's all for naught. But everyone who hears these words of mine does not act like them will be the foolish man who built his house on the sand. See, hearing is followed by belief and action, or no action, right? Jesus is ending his sermon with both a warning and a challenge. This is what happens if you do not listen, if you do not pay attention, if you do not put your belief in me, if you do not do what I have been saying. Whoever hears these words of mine, everything I have been saying and I'm going to say, everything I have ever said is now on the table. Everything Jesus ever said through Moses and the prophets, all the way through Paul and his letters, all the way to the end. You see, again, this is all about Jesus. And the challenge then is, at the end of the day, if you're on that hillside, remember how I said you don't get away. You don't get to go home. Because ultimately the question is, what are you going to do with Jesus? What are you going to do with Jesus? What are you going to do with what he's just said? How are you going to respond? Are you going to believe? Are you going to do? So the people that respond in faith and then do are the ones who build their houses on the rock. If you think you're going to leave and just go and do nothing or outright reject this, then at some point, again, final judgment, that's what that storm's about. When you meet your Maker, your house is going to crash. You see, Jesus is not talking. He is not giving a moral story about the kind of wisdom that doesn't allow your kids to play in traffic. He's talking about the end of all things here. And he has been talking about the end of all things. You heard Mike read it earlier. The false teachers who at that final judgment show up and they say, look, we did all these things in your name. And Jesus says, I never knew you. That's continuing here in this wise man and foolish man story. That great crash. That's what's going to happen if we walk away from Jesus without faith, without believing in who he is and his claims and what he has done and is doing for us. It's very easy to conclude here then, if we're not careful. It's very easy to read this. In fact, it's possible to read this if you go checking these things. It's very easy to read this and then come to some sort of conclusion that everything in my eternal destiny is based on what I do, my works. And you can't go there. We're going to get to that in a minute. Not only is that not the witness of the entire Bible, it's not even what's going on here. You see, if we begin to trust our works in order to save us at the judgment day, then ironically, we are the ones who have built our house on the sand. And we are in for a big crash. Because listen again, listen to the story. Listen to the story of what Jesus is saying. Because it does not allow us to go there. And that's this. What is it at the last day when the storm comes? When the ultimate storm comes, what is it that keeps the house standing? When the storm comes, what is it that allows the house to fall? You see, the one sitting there that day giving this sermon is presenting himself as the salvation, as the rescue, as the foundation for all of life. He is not only simply presenting himself as an authority on par or bigger than Moses and the Old Testament, he is presenting himself as the rescue, as the salvation. Because what is it that he has said? What is it that saves us in the last day? Everyone who hears these words of mine and does them is like the man who has built his house on the rock. It's not the hearing, it's not the doing, it's the rock that keeps the house from collapse. Conversely, if you think that life is better off without Jesus, and we can go our own way and do our own thing, then there is no rock. All you have left is sand. You see, this isn't simply an allegory. This isn't simply some fancy story. No, this is Jesus letting these people know on that hillside, look, you've got a bunch of false teachers. You've got a bunch of people who are vying for your attention. And I am presenting to you myself. I am your rescue. I am your life. I am your salvation. You plant your life on me. And at the last day, you'll be fine. Your house will be standing. Not because of what you've done, not because of anything it's because of the rock. It's because I am there, providing your salvation, providing your rescue. So, as we come to this study, we are looking to be like Jesus. We have to remind ourselves that being like Jesus begins with who Jesus is for us. He's a rock. And yes, the precursor to that final storm are all the other difficulties that go on in life. You know how you have made Jesus your rock? The one in whom you are placing your trust? Where does your mind go? Where does your heart go when things go bad? When things get tough? When the students get crazy? When the technology doesn't work? Where do you go? Who do you turn to? Some of you have faced and are facing some difficult things in your life. Where's your hope? Where's your faith? I encourage you this morning, I invite you this morning to put your faith and your trust and all of your hopes in the person who is presenting himself on that hillside, talking about a wise man and a foolish man. Let's pray. Jesus, I thank you so much, all you have done for us. I pray that we hear these words, we have faith in these words, and we put these words into practice, that we spend our every waking moment trying to be like you, putting those things that you've told us into practice. But at the same time, I pray that our hope and our faith and our trust at the end of the day isn't in what we are hearing or doing, but it's in you, our foundation. Thank you for who you are and what you've done for us. In your name I pray. Amen. The wise men, do you have the communion? Oh, Justin does. I'm going to put this in front here. I'm going to put this right here. I just clean my hands, so that's safe. But the wise man and the foolish man are here today in our table this morning. They are. You know, in order for us, in order for Jesus to be the rock, in order for him to rescue us, in order for him to give us his wisdom so that we can be wise people, he had to die the death of a fool. That storm came, and Jesus allowed his house to crash on that night because of you and me and us. You see, he was out to save people. He was out to be the rock, and the only way to become the rock is to die the death of the foolish, because we're fools, all of us. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we've all been foolish. We don't trust Jesus like we're supposed to. We don't have the faith. And so we need Jesus. We need his salvation. And so he became a fool so that we would be wise and become wise. And that's this table for us. Christ's wisdom for us. The foolishness of the cross for us, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians. That's here this morning. So, I invite you, fools, all of us, to come and get wisdom from Jesus this morning, because he provides it here at his table. He is providing it in his word. He provides it in the table.